history of history. History. What is it? A search for truth? To see things as they actually were? A conversation between two people where one is dead and one is a pointy-headed intellectual? These are all definitions I learned when I was in graduate school so long ago. Why do we care? Americans, of which I am one, generally do not care about history unless they can use it or some simulacrum of it. That everything we humans are is built upon enormous interconnected structures. I don't really mean structures in a Marxist sense, but I mean if you're a Marxist and you're into that sort of thing, sure. Vast webs of things which came before us and allowed the present to be what it is. History does not repeat itself. The phrase was popularized in Modern Memory by Karl Marx in his 18th of Brumaire de Louis Napoleon in 1851, but people do things for the same reasons as they did in the past. You know, lust, greed, hatred, love. And because large institutions tend toward the easiest and cheapest solutions, it seems like history is a continuous repetition of events. Further, humans are enmeshed in webs of culture which stretch back millennia and inform our present whether we like it or not. Concepts like the state, government, economy have long trails of development which snake back into the past. Sometimes, of course, elements of the past are used as propaganda and in propaganda to make a political view look old. This happens all the time in the United States. You know, make America great again, that kind of thing. You kind of can see it in the way the Nazis used Nazi images over top of old images, like in Leni Riefenstahl's movie, Triumph of the Will, to blend the old with the new to make the new look older and more venerable than it really is, more connected with the past. So then, one of the dangers of an ignorance of history is that one becomes susceptible to propaganda because it can seem reasonable. That's really important. So, with that being said, let us start at the beginning. Ancient Kemet, or ancient Egypt, after the Romans renamed it. Egypt isn't an Egyptian word. It refers to a pair of brothers or something like that the Romans thought came from there, so they just called it Egyptus. And because Rome dominated the region until the 5th century AD, the name stuck. Hence, Egypt, not Kemet. Much of ancient history, that is, history done by ancient peoples, is actually propaganda, convincing us or describing to us the orthodox, that is, pure or true, correct way of viewing reality. Roman historians, such as Tacitus and Livy, for example, are great primary sources. In fact, they are the only primary sources for some things, but they are also definitely mouthpieces for the Roman state, and that must definitely be taken into account when using them. The Egyptians didn't really have a Tacitus or a Livy, at least not one that survived. And they used papyrus in a lot of their writing, so it's entirely possible that much of there was a Tacitus or a Livy in Egypt didn't survive. Doesn't mean, however, just because it didn't survive, that they were ahistorical. In fact, ancient Egypt, we can argue, very convincingly, is the font or origin of much of what becomes bound up in that wonderful nebulous concept so hot on the internet with the political right, apparently, the West. So, how did these Egyptians do history? We have one ancient Egyptian building, for example, the Sokar, the Ramesseum, which this is from the 13th century BC. So this BC, I'm very old school, so BC, AD, BC being before Christ, AD being Anno Domini, and those concepts come from England, actually, from the Venerable Bede, who was trying to determine when when Christ would return. So he had to be able to calculate properly. So he created a system for doing this, and gave us this system based upon when Christ was born. Anyway, the Ramesseum, see this beautiful series of pictures, functioned as a pharaonic archive, a record of names and deeds of many, but not all, monarchs up to Ramses II. The cartouches are brief, and the selection process is clearly biased, as Ramses and his father, Seti I, built it. But it gives us at least a starting list of monarchs, and to some degree, their order, which is pretty important when trying to establish history. We have documents which were written on papyrus, such as the Instruction of Amenemope, also 13th century BC, which have survived to us. The instruction is a series of admonitions and pieces of advice that a father, the eponymous Amenemope, is giving to his son, who will inherit his office, that of scribe. They read like proverbs. Beware the angry man yelling in the marketplace. Don't cheat widows. Don't commit murder. No homosexuality. Stuff like that. And so in some communities, they are perceived to be an early precursor to the Book of Proverbs, if not an outright origin point. That is the Book of Proverbs from the Old Testament. There is certainly a sense of history in Egyptian images. The wiping out of the Hyksos and the reconquest of the Nile Delta is recorded, for example, in many places as a key event. And we know that was because of what happens later, but no history of that event survives from the Egyptians in the sense of an analysis. Instead, what we have is propaganda. Stories of epic battles like Kadesh and Armageddon, from which we get the word Armageddon, which determined the boundaries between ancient Egypt and its neighbors in Syria and Palestine, are recorded on boundary stones, emblazoned upon public monuments, and on clay tablets, which reveal the diplomatic maneuverings between the Egyptians and their enemies, the Hittites. On the public buildings in Egypt, the battles are divine victories. but in the correspondence it's clear they were actually closer to draws. All sources tell different stories. It's really like, for example, listening to Henry Kissinger's public declarations, his speeches, his articles, while serving as National Security Advisor from 1969 to 73 and Secretary of State 73 to 77, and reading something like Seymour Hersh's Price of Power. While Hersh's star certainly faded, and he may be crazy when he's talking about the Ukraine war, but the Price of Power gives us a really clear look at Kissinger in the Nixon White House, and that does not match the public oration that Kissinger gave us. Funny how that goes. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. Political power using propaganda to tell the people a story that serves the political purposes. Let's now look at another Egyptian artifact, the earliest record of a human event, it has been called, also the earliest political statement, perhaps even a historical document. The Victory Palette of Narmer dates to about 3200 to 3000 BC, far, far older than Ramses and his Ramesseum. It's a cosmetics mixing palette. That is, you didn't actually go to Walmart to buy your cosmetics. If you were going to put coal on your eyes in the morning, you got your mixing palette out, you took out your little jar of hippopotamus fat and some charcoal, and you mixed it up on your palette with a small wooden or perhaps a stone tool, and you applied that hippopotamus fat because it doesn't run in the heat of the Nile Delta. So this is a big piece. It's 63 centimeters tall. It's topped by a serach, a composite symbol for the king, the crown, and the state. And we have the symbols, the hieroglyphic symbols, Nra for catfish and Nra for chisel, the phonetics, which form Narmer's name. That is the eponymous Narmer. Now, this piece has a weird history to it because it comes from that lovely period of archaeology, which is really theft, in which wealthy people from Europe and the United States traveled to Egypt and dug up things and took them home. These artifacts became parts of private collections. They became the focuses of museum pieces. Eventually, it was outlawed, which is why the treasures of Tutankhamun never left Egypt, though they not without trying, right? Okay, so this particular piece was found in Egypt, and truthfully, we sort of know where it was found. It was discovered in 1897-98 by British archaeologists, quote-unquote, James Quidall and Frederick Green, in what they called the Temple of Horus, near Nechem. Little of its discovery, or the place of its discovery, the facts of it, the stratigraphy, are clearly documented. It's been guessed that it possibly might be a donation to a temple. 63 centimeters is pretty big, and it's not the kind of thing you can easily move around on your cosmetics table. On the other hand, if this was actually owned by the king, he would have a big cosmetics table, and maybe he would like a big mixing palette. Who knows? We don't know. But we have this piece. We have these two bovine heads at the top of it, flanking the serach. Sometimes they're thought to be Hathor, but sometimes they're also thought to be Bat. Both are cow goddesses. Both are fertility deities. And when we're looking at this piece, it's important to think of it kind of like a graphic novel. The top register, where this little bar is here, that register is things that are happening above. that is sort of in a divine world. Then in the middle area, the second register below that, those are things happening on Earth. And then below it, there's other things happening. So think of ancient Egyptian art sort of like that, as if it is a graphic novel. So the two divine beings, the cows, they are blessing what's going on with their benediction, as it were. Below them, we have Narmer with his mace striding forward, wearing the crown of southern Egypt. He's the tallest creature depicted, tallest character in ancient Egypt. Height indicated power. It wasn't just simply a random thing. The taller a person, then it didn't mean they were really tall. It just meant that they were powerful. He's also shown with his legs open, turned torso towards us, and he has on his belt, he has actually a little Hathor figure. He is got the hair of his enemy king in his hand, and he is about to strike him, kill him with his mace. Okay? So we have this king figure, and we have this king figure being killed. Note this king figure. Note this figure that we see here, because this is going to become an archetype for monarchs. Not just for Egypt. It's certainly going to be for Egypt, but it's also going to be for the West. This is going to be our image of the powerful Lord, the powerful King. Now we have a couple of other things happening over here. We have Horus flying overhead. Interestingly enough, in a world kind of before, he's the child of Isis, and the fuck's his name? The other one, because they're not really that important at this point. Horus is important. Okay, there's a debate among scholars as to the function of this thing. Scholars like Nicholas Millett, Whitney Davis, Marion Lichdom, famous Egyptologists, have argued about what the purpose of this artifact was, whether it actually was intended to mix cosmetics, or whether it was an offering piece, whether it was a ceremonial piece. We can debate those things, but it's clearly telling a story, and it may be a form of history itself, a history of unification, a history of the unification of southern and northern Egypt. It also clearly veers into the realm of propaganda. The gods bless the conquests, many gods, and the enemy king is killed. Think about this, folks. This is the cornerstone upon which the concept of lordship, kingship, is going to be based on. The big man rearing back his arm with a mace and smashing the head of the enemy king. There you go. If Egypt is the home to the oldest political document, it's also home to the oldest religious document. The pyramid texts, they can be found in their earliest version in the pyramid of the pharaoh Unas, and here we have pictures of the interior of it. You can see the hieroglyphs as they run all throughout it, pretty much in a continuous text. And this is, again, this isn't history, but it gives us a very interesting idea, especially a good window into the funerary culture of the Egyptians, what they thought they were trying to do, the idea of essentially bringing the pharaoh back to life and then transporting him to this place where he, essentially on the moon, where he would have this, or on the sun, where he would have this live with the gods, this sort of tenement project. The pyramid texts are pretty interesting. But again, it's not history. So we have to piece together lots and bits and pieces of Egyptian stuff and put it together in order to derive from it a history. So let's leave Egypt now. There we go. Leave Egypt now and head east into Mesopotamia, a place where there's another pretty powerful and large civilization. These Mesopotamians, we know them as Iraqis today, and we Americans are very familiar with Iraq because of our really ill-conceived war and bashing of the Iraqi people for no damn good reason other than the misguided belief that there were WMDs there somewhere. But there weren't. And so hundreds of thousands have died, and a state has destabilized, and yeah. Anyway, we're familiar with it. So there are a lot of monarchs in ancient Mesopotamia, and the bulk of the texts that we have, accounts, are all really propaganda. Propaganda for the monarchs. Until the Akkadians, Mesopotamia is really just a welter of city-states along two very troublesome rivers, which frequently flooded and changed their courses, reflected, of course, in the flood stories in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we see here. We see a river god redirecting the fish. See that? A little fish moving through the air. Isn't that awesome? Fucking love that stuff. Epic of Gilgamesh. Speaking of which, from somewhere around 2100 BC, we have this long saga. And it's written on clay tablets in cuneiform. So it survived far better than the Egyptian papyruses because clay tablets become almost stone-like. Though, as you can see, they can still be broken. It's still not a history. It's a story with lots of mythological characters and events, divine prostitutes who tame the wild Enkidu, the buddy of the eponymous Gilgamesh, by having sex with him until he is civilized. And perhaps my favorite character, Humbaba, the ogre king, a demigod, son of the gods. And here's a picture of him actually being slain by Enkidu and Gilgamesh, an act for which the gods were pretty pissed. Also, like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians had a strong historical sense of themselves. And it could be also like the Egyptians that their historical sources didn't survive. But it also could be that they didn't write histories. At least not histories like what we understand as a history. So we go a little farther east and we run into Dravidic civilizations in northern India, modern Pakistan. They haven't really deciphered their texts, but there's a great movie called Mohenjo-Daro. So we know that their text hasn't been deciphered. So here you see the image of the famous Mohenjo-Daro unicorn. We can't read it. So there's lots of examples of this Dravidic text, but I can't read it. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but I love it. It's fantastic. There's lots of examples of post-Dravidic Aryan conquest, migration, quote-unquote, texts, but we'll get to that stuff later. We circle back around to the west, to the Mycenaeans in the 1200s BC, and we've got linear B writing, lots of lists of property. I own this piece of armor, I own so many horses, I own so many slaves, but no history. In fact, the history of those people, who we understand as the people that started the Trojan War, right? That's the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, from the 8th century BC. Long stories, epic poems, to be read aloud, with gods and mythic characters and magic, but concerning actual places and maybe even actual peoples. Okay, some of them maybe even lived. Lots of characters. So it's against that Homeric kind of story that we get finally to something that approximates history as we in the 2023 might actually recognize it, and that would be Herodotus, who gets oftentimes appellated as father of history or father of lies. You know, a character who is appropriated and beloved by the Western canon and by the West, quote unquote, school, the Westernization, or he's sort of the base plate of the West. Okay, he's an Asiatic Greek. He's from Halicarnassus, born somewhere in the 480s. He tells this story of the Persian Wars against the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War, as it's actually being fought out in between Sparta and Athens. So he's telling this epic story of how Athens and Sparta eventually dealt with the Persians against the backdrop of the civil war between those two states, those two city-states. A couple of things about Herodotus. Historian isn't his job, it's his hobby. He takes it on as his avocation because he can. Why can he do that? Because he's a man and he's independently wealthy. And this is going to be a pattern that is going to become the main hallmark of how history is done for a very long period of time. Men, independently wealthy, telling the story of how the world is, unironically excluding everybody but themselves, and taking a point of view that is most definitely their own. So Herodotus, we have to understand his historia. Really, that's Greek for an inquiry, a broad inquiry. And what he does is he goes and he says he travels to these places. He gets lots of secondhand accounts. He says he travels to Egypt. He travels to Syria. He travels all over the place. He has a whole list of types of sources. He describes this, the first-hand interviews, written, and then tradition. There are a lot of very interesting things going on. It's almost more of a travelogue than it is what we would understand as history, though he does have some interesting uh, um, comments in that regard. It's also important to understand that Herodotus wasn't paid by anybody to make this. He's not a government agent, and this isn't propaganda. Not in the sense we've seen it before. This isn't like Narmer's victory palette. This isn't like the Kadesh monuments. This is something very different. This is somebody who's not the king, not the agent of the king. He's an agent of himself to some degree. He's certainly the agent of his class, and certainly the agent of his maleness and his place in society. His independent wealth allows him to do this. Nonetheless, this is entirely different. This is different than anything else that's come before it. So it has to be understood that first out. This isn't propaganda in that sense. This is an actual attempt to tell, as he says, tell the truth. He wants to record these deeds because he thinks they were really important. And he's apparently within written memory of many of these events, so he can actually do that. Now, there's lots of mistakes, lots of errors. He records lots of customs, sexual practices, lots of crazy stories of people. My favorite are the people with their heads in their chests out in the far east. The Libyans who speak like bats. Those are fantastic. I mean, none of that's real, but funeral practices, all sorts of, and the cute cannibals, the cannibal funerary priests, those are fantastic as well. So a lot of this is coming from second hand, or from tradition, and so he doesn't obviously see any of that kind of stuff. He's responded to in this history by Thucydides, who's coming at the very end. And I kind of want to read some of Herodotus just to give you a little sense of what it's like and what his arguments and ideas were before we move on from him. All right, here we go. And this is from the Penguin Classics edition of Herodotus. Book 1. In this book, the result of my inquiries into history, I hope to do two things. To preserve the memory of the past by putting on record the astonishing achievements both of our own and of the Asiatic peoples. Secondly, and more particularly, to show how the two races came into conflict. Persian historians put the responsibility for the quarrel on the Phoenicians. These people came originally from the coast of the Indian Ocean, and as soon as they had penetrated into the Mediterranean and settled in that part of the country where they are today, they took to making long trading voyages, loaded with Egyptian and Assyrian goods they called at various places along the coast, including Argos, in those days the most important of the countries, now called by the general name Hellas. So that's how the book reads. That's how he describes history. So let's pause at the very end of this thing as I wrap this up. We have paid propagandists who put together such things as the Victory Ballad of Narmer, the Ramesseum, the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps. This is certainly a tale. Tales like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And then we have this thing that's Herodotus. And the only really the thing that separates these things, the propaganda that came before from Herodotus, it's not race. It's not anything like that. It's not wealth. Because really, if you think about it, 5th century Athenian wealth is, while it's wealthy, it's certainly not wealthy as far as lords in Syria or lords in Egypt. It's democracy, because he can write that. He doesn't have to trumpet the king's mouthpiece. He doesn't have to be the king's mouthpiece. So there you go. We got a couple of things here. We've got the first image of a historical event, and it's a king smashing another king's skull in, or just about to. And we've got some very early images of propaganda. And then we finally, and a lot of stories, we've got a lot of very interesting stories with characters and places that we can point to and say, maybe that existed in the places, throughout the Iliad, there are places that really do exist. Throughout Gilgamesh's epic, there are places really do exist. And then we get to Herodotus, and we're starting to actually tell a story of history. And then we'll go on from there. So, thanks for listening. Good night.
Okay, this is the footnotes, endnotes, bibliography, sources part of the talk. And start out with the book, A History of Ancient Egypt by Nicolas Grémal. It was originally in French. And the edition I have is translated by Ian Shaw. It's 1988, and then it was reprinted. The one I have is 2001. It's an excellent text. It is a really good basic level text with some reasonable depth to it. It has a series of time charts in it, timelines, and then it also has a series of has a glossary, and then it has a whole series of family trees, and then it has the bibliography at the back of it is fully a quarter of the book. And one of the things you find when you start looking at the bibliography of ancient Egyptian history is it's overwhelmingly done by Europeans, and you have a lot of French, German, Italian, English, and these languages are kind of essential if you're going to do some scholarship in this stuff, so actually serious scholarship. And then you see that in Grémal. It's really good. Second piece of Egyptian literature that I got that I use is really good. It's Merriam-Lichtheim, Ancient Egyptian Literature. This particular one is Volume 2, The New Kingdom. There's a Volume 1, The New Kingdom. And she's also got a whole bunch of articles. She's predominantly a translator, so she gives you some fantastic translations of all sorts of different things. These are sampler type pieces, so this is samples of things. There are much larger and much more complete surveys of these things. They were done by German schools at various points in time. But Merriam-Lichtheim's fantastic stuff. The third Egyptian one that I have is called Pharaohs of the Sun, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun, and it's actually an exhibit book, and it was done by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and I think this is 1999? 1999, yeah. It is a beautiful, gorgeous book with lots of articles in it. It's a deep dive that is very heavy on artifacts, artifact analysis, and then the orientation of artifacts within society, how the society would have used them, and what they meant to the society, who made them, how were they, how were they got out to various peoples in the society, that kind of thing. So it's pretty awesome stuff. Um, on Mesopotamia, I've got Gwendolyn Likes Mesopotamia, the Invention of a City. And basically, it's got 10 chapters, and each chapter is a city. So you get Eridu, Uruk, Shuruppak, Akkad, Nippur, Sippar, Ashur, Nineveh, and Babylon. All put together as each one gets its own chapter. And this is 2001. So still 20 years old, but a pretty good um, book if you already know something about Mesopotamia. Yeah, it's not going to give you a ton of this is the Fertile Crescent and this is why the city-states were the way they were and things like that. And finally, for the Greeks, John finds The Ancient Greeks, a critical essay. It's a monster. It is a fantastic book. It's Harvard University Press, 1983, and 700 odd pages. And it is a very intense, deep dive from the Archaic period up until the Battle of Chaeronea and the Macedonian conquest. And then there's a second volume that's the Macedonian Empire that goes with this. And Fine is fantastic. He's huge, but he's also eminently readable. So that's, I'm going to throw some more stuff up here bibliographically. And that's about it as far as text for sources go. Okay, this is the coda to the entire piece. Thank you very much for listening to this mess and watching the slides and the videos. Appreciate it. I guess it's like it and subscribe, etc. I have to create a Patreon account. I haven't done that quite yet, but I'll put a PayPal link in there if you really want to donate. That would be marvelous. I super appreciate it. And if you got this far, well, thank you very much. I'm going to make more of these. This was a lot of fun to make. There was a lot of interesting stuff. I have a really rudimentary microphone, and it shows, and a really rudimentary computer, and that shows as well. So all my programs are pretty rudimentary. So I'm sort of like, I have a mammoth hide, and I'm trying to scrape out the history on it with a flint knife or some shit like that. So, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Yeah, it's falling.